James was fired for telling the truth, but those who tried to break him didn't realize they would be the ones to fall. One traitor in the family, and the entire empire crumbled. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. James Carter, a 42-year-old data analyst at Bright Futures Tech, was used to working in the shadows. Over the past 10 years, he had proven his value by developing cutting-edge data analysis systems. But despite his achievements, he was never promoted. To the company's leadership, he was merely a valuable specialist, not a leader. Today, he sat in the large conference hall during the quarterly executive meeting. The atmosphere was tense. Layoffs were on the agenda. Richard Barnes, the CEO, spoke with confidence. The company must remain competitive. That means underperforming employees will be let go. A few people exchanged nervous glances. Then, suddenly, someone made a joke about how some people find it easier just to live off welfare. Barnes laughed loudly. Exactly. Some people are just not meant to climb higher. Laughter rippled through the room, but James clenched his fists. He knew exactly who they were talking about. He didn't want a scene, but he couldn't stay silent either. "Excuse me, but that's inappropriate," he said firmly. Silence fell. Barnes narrowed his eyes and slowly turned toward him. "What did you say? Jokes like that are toxic. We're discussing layoffs and you're mocking people. Is this really our corporate culture?" A few people nodded subtly, but most avoided eye contact. Barnes took a step closer, his icy gaze locked onto James. "Are you telling me how to run my company, Carter? I'm reminding you that respect is the foundation of teamwork." Barnes smirked. "I'll remember that." The meeting continued, but James knew he had crossed a line. A few hours later, an email popped up on his screen. "Carter, report to HR immediately." He took a deep breath. The war had begun. James walked toward the HR department with a tightness in his chest. He knew what was coming. Everyone who entered that office after a conflict with management disappeared from the company without a trace. Bright Futures Tech loved to preach about corporate ethics and equal opportunities, but the reality was far different. Black employees rarely rose above the mid-level positions, and now one of the few who had managed to succeed had become enemy number one. The confrontation in HR. Behind a massive desk sat Michael Green, the director of HR. Across from him, Richard Barnes himself, lounging in his chair with the air of a man who had already won. "Sit down, Carter." Barnes gestured toward the chair opposite him. James sat, but didn't relax. "Do you know why you're here?" Barnes interlocked his fingers. "Not yet, but I suppose I'm about to find out." Barnes smirked. "You've been with this company for 10 years. You're a valuable employee, but we have rules. The company must move forward, and yesterday you made it clear that you don't share our vision." "And what vision is that?" James locked eyes with him. "Loyalty," Barnes answered with a smile. A brief silence followed. James noticed Green shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It seemed he had been dragged into this against his will. "So, that's why you're firing me." James cut straight to the point. Barnes shrugged. "This isn't a firing, it's an optimization. We're downsizing. My department generates more revenue than any other in the company." James kept his voice steady, though he was boiling inside. "Numbers can be flexible." Barnes feigned sympathy. "Don't worry, you'll get severance. Everything is by the book." James stared into the eyes of the man who had so easily decided his fate. "You want me to leave quietly, don't you?" "That would be the smart choice." Barnes nodded. "And if I refuse to sign the papers?" Barnes leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then you'll have problems. References? Forget it. You won't work for a major company again. One phone call and every door will close. Green tensed, but remained silent. Is that a threat? James kept his composure, but rage burned inside him. Barnes smiled. It's advice. My last one. The point of no return. James took the envelope with the papers, but didn't open it. He knew that if he signed, it would mean surrender. You're making a mistake if you think this will be quiet, he said calmly. Barnes scoffed. Seriously? No one cares about your fight, Carter. Listen to that? Silence. No one in this office will stand up for you. James glanced outside. Behind the glass walls of the HR department, his colleagues sat at their desks, working in silence, pretending nothing was happening. But there was something Barnes didn't know. In the next office, behind a semi-transparent partition, someone was recording everything. And they had no intention of staying silent. James left the HR office, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment boiling inside him. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed how his colleagues avoided his gaze. Just yesterday, he was a respected analyst. Today, he was someone everyone tried to ignore. But he had no idea that everything was just beginning. Explosion on social media. That evening, as James was browsing job listings, his phone buzzed with an overwhelming number of notifications. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Everywhere, his name was making headlines. An anonymous account had posted a video from the HR office, footage of Barnes openly threatening him and practically admitting that the firing was an act of revenge. Below the video, the caption read, "A black employee was fired for refusing to tolerate racism. This is what corporate values at Bright Futures Tech look like?" The video went viral, racking up tens of thousands of shares and furious comments. People were demanding answers. But the biggest shock was the source of the leak. A secret ally. The next day, James received a call from an unknown number. You should know that I was the one who posted it. James recognized the voice. David Barnes, the younger brother of the CEO and heir to the family business empire. You? James couldn't believe it. I can't stay silent anymore. I've watched my brother destroy people over and over, but this time he crossed the line. This is his downfall. James gripped the phone tighter. What are you planning? Keep your phone close. Today at 4 p.m. I'm holding a press conference. Barnes' downfall, at the scheduled time. Every news network broadcast David's speech. He stood in front of the company headquarters, surrounded by reporters, and spoke bluntly. Bright Futures Tech calls itself an inclusive company, but that's a lie. My brother has been accused of racism before, but today we have undeniable proof. He fired James Carter simply for speaking the truth. Journalists bombarded him with questions. What are you proposing? David lifted his chin. I demand his resignation. Panic at Bright Futures Tech. By 5 p.m., the company's stock had plummeted by 12%. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Barnes tried to justify himself, but it was too late. Social media had erupted with calls to boycott the company. And just 2 hours after David's statement, an official announcement was released. CEO Richard Barnes has been dismissed. We condemn all forms of discrimination and will conduct an internal investigation. James stared at the screen, unable to believe it. Barnes had lost. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. Barnes was gone, but the battle wasn't over. James knew that firing the CEO was just the tip of the iceberg. Bright Futures Tech had been covering up systemic discrimination for years. People like him had suffered in silence. But now, everything had changed, an offer he couldn't ignore. The next day, James received an unexpected call. "Carter, it's David Barnes. We need to talk." They met at a small cafe, away from the cameras. "I want change," David began. "I'm taking over the company, but to rebuild its reputation, I need someone who knows the system from the inside, someone who can help create a new corporate culture. And you think that someone is me?" James didn't hide his skepticism. "You were the only one brave enough to stand up to him." James thought for a moment. He had the chance not just to punish Barnes, but to change a company that had symbolized corporate racism for years. He extended his hand. "I'll do it, but only if I have full control over the reforms." Rebuilding the system. In the months that followed, Bright Futures Tech underwent radical changes. The internal investigation uncovered dozens of cases of racial discrimination. Barnes wasn't the only one who fell, so did those who had protected him. For the first time in the company's history, black leaders joined the board of directors. James was appointed head of corporate justice, overseeing company-wide policy changes. New anti-bias training sessions were introduced at internal meetings, and employee complaints were now investigated without fear of retaliation. The final conversation with Barnes one day, James was told he had a visitor. Richard Barnes entered the office, without his usual smug grin. "You destroyed everything I built," he hissed. James stood up, meeting his gaze. "No," he said firmly. "I fixed what you built." Barnes clenched his fists but said nothing. He knew he had lost. "You'll regret this." "Not anymore," James replied. Barnes turned and walked out. Forever. Conclusion. A new era. A year later, Bright Futures Tech had become a model of corporate ethics. In an interview, James said, "When I first spoke up, I thought I was alone. But the truth always finds allies. Today, this company isn't just a business. It's a symbol of change." A story that began with injustice ended in victory. James proved, one voice can change the system.